Welcome to the Indiana Bar Foundation's 2022 We the People Spring Professional Development Workshop. And today we're going to focus on the First Amendment. This is a continuation of our professional development series on learning and teaching civics and constitutional topics. We are going to do one more professional development opportunity as the school year ends. That's our annual Summer Institute. And I'll talk about that after all of this is done today. And we're going to continue planning additional PD opportunities for next school year, so stay tuned. We are excited that so many teachers can join us today and will continue to join us for these future events. We hope you find this to be useful to learn the content and teaching strategies to bring more information to you in your classroom. As you've seen on our agenda, we have two presentations today. We will start with Professor Chris Bryant, and we'll take a short break. And then we'll have Andrea Neal join us for her presentation. I'm sure this isn't anyone's first Zoom meeting, but just a few best practices to get started. If you don't mind, please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. If you may choose to keep your video on or off, whatever your preference is. And we might recommend watching in speaker view. That way you can see our presenter and their materials more clearly. You might also want to choose to hide non-video participants so blank boxes don't take up valuable real estate on your screen. If you haven't done so, it'd be interesting if you rename yourself with your name and your school or grade level that you teach so we can see where everybody is. And I've talked to our presenters and they do enjoy that interactive presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to either digitally raise your hand or just jump in and ask. You can also post questions and comments in the Zoom chat box, and we'll monitor those and at pausing points, call on you to ask your question. Or if you'd rather send the question directly to me, I can ask it on your behalf as well. So today, again, we're looking at the First Amendment. It's timely, it's relevant, it's standards-based. It's important to know our government protections and freedoms given to us by the Bill of Rights. So we're going to be excited to take a deep dive into this, and we're going to start with Professor Bryant. Chris Bryant, he is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Cincinnati's College of Law. He has published in multiple universities' law reviews and publications, including through Cornell University, George Washington, BYU, Notre Dame, Georgia, William and Mary. He's won his school's Goldman Prize of Excellence in Teaching multiple times, a member of the American Society for Legal History and the Federalist Society, serves as the faculty advisor to the college's Federalist Society chapter. Professor Bryant has worked with the We the People program as now for many years, not to totally age or out that here, but that's how I've had the pleasure of working with him for probably close to 10 years now. So the Indiana Bar Foundation is pleased to introduce Professor Chris Bryant.
Thanks so much, Tim, and thanks to, can everyone hear me okay? So thanks so much to Tim and to all of you for spending this time with me, because I have been a active participant in We the People programming for more than a decade, significantly more than a decade, in 3 states now. I'm happy to add Indiana, which is my home state, to the list. I started teaching law actually in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I had a lot to do with We the People out there. And then when I moved back to Ohio, that's where I met Tim. And now I'm kind of following Tim to help out with what I know is a fantastic program in Indiana. And I just want to start, I don't want to take too much time in this, but to say that you have my undying gratitude for the work that you're doing and your involvement in this program, because I can't say enough about how important I think civic education is and how vital it is that we enhance our offerings in this area. So anything I can do to help in any way is an enormous privilege. And so I'm going to share, I have some PowerPoint slides, so let me, today, of course, we are talking about the First Amendment, and more specifically, the First Amendment's protection of the freedom of the press. And I include here just this slide, and by the way, all these slides, I should say at the right at the outset, are available in the Dropbox that Tim has created. So don't feel any need to copy down anything that appears on a slide unless you want to. Because you'll have it all, and you have my permission to use these in any way that are helpful to you. So if you just want to copy a slide and use it, that's fine. If you want to cut and paste some language from a slide, that's great. And in fact, and as you'll see, I've included quite a bit of language on some of the slides, not so much because I think you'll read them during this presentation or I'll read them to you. I'll kind of focus on highlights, but I figured that was a way to kind of give you key text in a way that you might be able to use. So anyway, and also this slide is to give you my contact information, which is my email address here. And please understand this as an open invitation. I would be delighted to hear from any of you at any point if there's any way I can help, and I really mean that. All right, so I like to start by just kind of giving people a sense of what we're doing here and what lies ahead. So we're going to be talking about the freedom of the press, and I'm going to actually focus on a couple of time periods, I guess we could say. One is where all this started, sort of founding era understandings, and we're going to try to access that by comparing and contrasting the perspectives of two 18th century British sources on the issue, and then how that was refracted in the debate in the early Republic about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And we'll talk just a little bit about what the significance of that for today, but then actually the second half of the presentation is about the law today governing these topics. And I think you'll see that this history carries through in important ways. The Alien and Sedition Acts controversy concerned the power of the law to restrict defamation of public officials. And so I'm going to turn then to a discussion of the contemporary jurisprudence concerning the limitations on recovery for defamation. And that the principal decision there is New York Times v. Sullivan. I also have included in the Dropbox a number of supplementary sources that I think might be of use to you. I erred on the side of inclusion, so don't be intimidated by those materials. These are not your assignments. You don't need to study all this, but I thought some of it might be helpful to you and be an easy way for you to access it. So, for example, I've included the ruling in New York Times v. Sullivan, as well as a more recent decision discussing controversy about that case. And then I'm going to turn to the other issue that really is traced back to the founding era, and that is the power of the government to censor the press. And by censor, I mean literally prevent publication. And the contemporary analog there is the government's power to seek judicial injunction of publication. And the principal case, both in terms of just the law, but also in terms of the culture. I mean, it was a major political event, as we'll discuss, is the Pentagon Papers case. And then, then my mouse is a little too sensitive. And so then I'm going to stop and questions, as Tim said, I'm open to questions throughout, but I also want to pause at that point in the presentation and make sure we have room for discussion and any questions that are lingering. And if time permits, I'm going to say a little bit about really recent controversies. I mean, the last handful of years that have arisen in the context of what might be thought of as a new frontier for the press, and that is communication via social media. If we don't have time for me to talk about that today, just realize that there are included in the Dropbox some materials that I think you'll find interesting on that score. There are two decisions, or really actually one decision and a separate opinion in the Knight First Amendment Institute case, which was a case originating in New York concerning President Trump's ability to remove people from his Twitter feed. And that I've included those different opinions because they're important for a couple of reasons. I think you'll see if you look at them. There's also actually, I'll confess to a little self-promotion here, albeit though of one of my alums, one of my favorite students, and that is Eli Hack, who graduated from the College of Law a couple of years ago. Now he graduated in 2020. He published a piece in our law review that I think is just excellent about this question of how the social media should be treated for First Amendment law. So I've included that. article as well as kind of an intro into the space. All right, so without further ado, let's get at it. Like I said, I'm going to start by talking about the origins and beginnings, the introduction of this concept. And the First Amendment is phrased in a way that's been observed that quite clearly indicates it is not meant to create rights out of whole cloth so much as it is to secure protection for rights that were the founding generation understood to already be rights they enjoyed. And so in part of understanding what was meant by the First Amendment's protection of the freedom of press, I think at least it's very important to think about, well, what were the rights of British subjects in this space? Now this is way too much on this slide, don't worry. I actually put it all on this slide just for the purpose of letting you see the full text again, in case you want to cut and paste. This is William Blackstone's summary of the freedom of the press. And Blackstone, as you may or may not know, was a hugely significant jurist and legal commentator in 18th century England. And actually, as important as he was in England, he was at least important in the United States, both during the colonial period and in the early republic, because law books were relatively scarce on this side of the Atlantic. And so Blackstone, he was like a professor. He was a professor and a jurist. He just wrote a book about the law, but he wasn't the law himself. But in the United States, his books kind of became the law, because there are lots of places where it was difficult to access the English reports of the original cases, but everybody had a copy of Blackstone. And so Blackstone kind of became almost like a code in the early republic. And so anyway, what he says is quite significant. And here's what he says about the freedom of the press. And basically he says it is entirely about preventing what he calls previous restraints or prior restraints on publication. But the freedom of the press in no way protects people who do publish things from punishment for what they publish. And so, for example, if you publish things that are later deemed to be blasphemous, immoral, treasonable, schismatical, seditious, or scandalous, well, then you can be punished. So you have a right to publish what you want. You don't have a right to be free from responsibility for it, so says Blackstone. And he says one of the reasons this is so important is because if you allow prior restraints, previous restraints, and what he's referring to here in particular was the abandonment in England of a licensing scheme. When Gutenberg just came up with this brand new fandangled invention, the printing press. For one, they were kind of big, cumbersome, and expensive things. And they were scary as hell to the powers that be, both like in the church and in government and things like that, because they were like, oh my gosh, it used to be, Bryant could stand on a soapbox and yell at maybe 10 people, 20 people would pay attention to him. But now he can put his crazy ideas into written form, print them, and distribute thousands of pamphlets immediately. And so, oh my gosh, this is an insane power to give to individuals, and it needs to be controlled. And so the British, as well as much of the Western world, started by licensing printing presses. You had to get a license to have one. It was kind of like the way you need a license now to have a radio station or a TV station. You needed one to have a printing press, and the licensor had the power to review everything you were going to publish beforehand and say okay or nay. And if you publish something without the licensor's permission, then your license will be taken away and you can be punished for that. And so Blackstone saying that was our law for a while, but we felt it was too restrictive because it allowed one person, the official licensor, to basically, decree what was acceptable for everybody else. And so we've moved away from that. And now what we do is we allow everyone to publish what they want. But if we decide what they published is bad or dangerous, then they can be punished, provided that their writings are shown to be of a pernicious tendency, upon a fair and impartial trial. Okay, and that's I highlight and bold this here because that's really the key, really a key point in the English understanding of freedom of press, the British common law, if you will, understanding of freedom of press. But again, he says there's no problem, there's no violation of the freedom of the press if you're punished for what you print after the fact. Now, one of the things, and this slide is here to kind of point out to us, this might seem, I think with good reason, kind of ridiculous because Twyn is a fellow, I refer to him here in the heading. Twyn is a guy who actually ended up suffering what was called then colloquially the traitor's death, and it is a very bad thing. I mean, death is a bad thing. The traitor's death makes death look like a cruise in the Bahamas. Okay, and Twyn suffered that horrible fate because he had published pieces that said the government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Okay. Crazy stuff, right? I mean, really radical stuff. And so you might think, and the point is Blackstone, he didn't comment on Twyn in particular, but he would say, yeah, that's fine. You can impose horrible punishments on Twyn for saying that because I don't know, maybe that's pretty dangerous stuff to say. And so for Blackstone envisions Twyn being carried away into the gallows in his cart, celebrating the beauty of British liberty, that he has freedom. He's about to be cruelly executed, but that's okay, because at least he had the freedom to lay his thoughts before the public, and we sort of say that's crazy because, only, the most insanely intrepid are going to try to engage in communication if they know they can suffer severe punishments if the government disapproves of what they say after the fact. And that is true. That is true. But there still is something, and we'll see in its contemporary counterpart, something really important to this idea about distinguishing after the fact sanction from prior restraint of publication. And one is there's this sense that, we all recognize intuitively the distinction between begging forgiveness and asking permission. As people say, sometimes it's better to go ahead and if you're called out, beg forgiveness, than it is to ask permission in the first place. And I think that, if you unpack that notion, there's a lot going on there, but I think the intuition lies in part by, if you're asking permission beforehand, then you kind of have to secure the fears of whoever is in charge of every possible thing that could go wrong, every possible misinterpretation of what you're going to do and what you're going to say. Whereas if you just say it and then after the fact you're called to account for it, then at least you're only kind of held responsible for how people actually perceive what you wrote, not their fears about what you might have published. And then this is why I talk about the trial point. The other thing that was really crucial for the Great British understanding of freedom of the press was that you only will be punished after a trial. And under other protections in Great Britain, that trial will be a trial by jury. Okay? And so the idea here is someone like Twyn eventually will probably be protected by jury trial because the jury will believe that he's got a point when he says the government exists for them, not the other way around. And so when they are called to convict him of treasonous publication, they'll acquit. They'll refuse to. And some of the great moments in kind of the cradle of free expression are exactly this. They're famous. The Peter Zenger case in colonial America. In Great Britain, there's this wonderful case where a jury refuses to convict William Penn. The British judge literally says, okay, you've heard the evidence. There's only one possible interpretation. This terrible Penn was handing out leaflets attacking the Church of England, and that's a crime, and he needs to be punished. So you guys just go back and you deliberate for a few minutes or whatever, but the only verdict you can come back with is guilty, okay? Because that's the only one that's possible, acceptable on the basis of the evidence. Anything else would be crazy. And the jury goes back to the room. They come back and the judge says, all right, now what's your verdict? And they say, not guilty. And the judge says, I'm sorry, you didn't hear me. Okay, there's a confusion here. I told you there's only one. And it turns out it becomes a standoff between that jury and that judge. But the jury won't budge. And at the end, Penn goes free. And so this is thought to be like a great moment in the evolution of free expression, because requiring the government to prove that what someone actually printed is actually harmful and have a jury convict is, limits their ability to attack at least some expression. Now, notice I have there at the end, what kind of speech will this protect? It's going to protect speech that, the public already agrees with, or at least already believes should be part of the discourse. It is not very protective of your dissident speech, your abolitionist in South Carolina in the 1830s, for example. But it probably protects your abolitionists in Boston. All right, so with that in mind, there's one other founding era source. I'm going to move very quickly through this because I know I need to stay on time. And that is, there was everybody wrote anonymously for reasons that should be clear at this point, why you might not want to sign your publications. And so there was this commentator who went under the name Cato. We now know that Cato was the work of John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, who were two kind of libertarian English thinkers who wrote very extensively in the early 18th century in support of broad understandings of liberty, such as the freedom of press and the freedom of speech. And Trenchard and Gordon, writing as Cato, was very popular on this side of the pond as well. And for example, it was said that Cato, in addition to writing pamphlets, also prepared, wrote a play about freedom and stuff like that. And that play was staged by George Washington at Valley Forge, that kind of thing. So there was a sense that, the founders really, drank at the well of Cato and really thought that this commentator was onto something. And so Cato, and I've created these slides largely so you have the text and you can use them as you see fit. I'll let you read them at your leisure. I've also included in the Dropbox a excerpt from a book I use that goes over all of this terrain and includes the excerpt from Blackstone, these excerpts from Trenchard and Gordon. So if you want to use any of that material, you certainly have my permission to do so. But basically, Cato says, Blackstone, you don't understand. We need more protection than you recognize. And that's because, and this is a really crucial point for where we're going to end up, that's because freedom of speech and freedom of the press is necessary to prevent government abuse of power. And so you see a lot of things in Trenchard and Gordon about you can't be free as a society. You can't be a self-governing society unless you are free to criticize your rulers. The people who are afraid of freedom of speech are the people who want to exercise power without accountability. It's true that we ought to all love our president and our Congress, or our king and our parliament, in their case. But you know what? The way that should happen is they should do the right things. And, and then we'll love them. But if they do bad things, we won't. Okay. And so, the way you show people are free is not that they celebrate the government. It's that they can criticize the government. Because then, if they go on to celebrate it, they mean it. Here's some more of this on the checking function. That the key thing is the government needs to make its actions subject to open examination, where they can be publicly scanned. And this makes freedom of speech or the press the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together. It is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them. And so again, the founding generation was really, absorbing this, and there's a lot of evidence that they really were enamored by this concept. So what happens in the early republic? Well, of course, we get the First Amendment is adopted in 1791. 7 years later, Congress passes the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act punishes the publication of any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the United States government or either House of Congress or the president, provided it's published with an intent to defame. And the punishment's significant. $2,000, which is real money then. It still seems a lot of money to me today, but was real money then. And imprisonment not exceeding 2 years for violation of the statute. Now, a key thing the defenders pointed out is that it included an opportunity to prove that what you said was true. It was defense to a prosecution that what you said was true, but the obligation was on the defendant to prove the truth. Madison, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, some really significant players at the time, adamantly, thoroughly opposed the statute as being contrary to all that was great in America, and in particular attacked it as being contrary to the freedom of speech and press. And here you have Madison says, the American understanding of freedom of the press is not the Blackstonian understanding. Okay, so he grabs hold of that and rejects it and says, we have a broader understanding. And he says we have to, because our governments are different. In Great Britain, all the concern is that the king will violate the rights of Parliament. But here, and that's because it's thought that Parliament is sovereign. But here, it's the people, not the Congress, that are sovereign. And the people need to hold all the government. The president, the Congress, everybody who exercises power needs to hold them accountable. And so to be effectual, this protection has to extend beyond mere prohibition on prior restraint, which had been in Great Britain in the hands of the monarch, and it has to protect people against after the fact punishment. He says, otherwise, I love this next line. He says, otherwise, it would be a mockery to freedom to say, like kind of as we reacted to say that you can publish whatever you want, you're just going to be punished for it. And he also says, hey, if we had had a statute like this one on the books during the Revolution, I'm not clear there would have been a revolution. Or if we'd had it on the books when we adopted the Constitution, I don't know we'd adopted the Constitution, because no one would have been able to criticize, say, for example, taxes on tea, or any of these other things. All right, so let me pause there just for a minute and see if I stirred up any questions that we ought to address at this point before I jump ahead 200 years to the 1960s. Let's see, there's something. Okay, that's just that's Tim. All right, well, I don't see anything, so I'm going to keep going. And like I said, there'll be a chance for more questions momentarily. All right, so what's the law today about defaming government officials or anybody else? As we'll see, eventually this is extended to public figures as well as public officials. But initially in New York Times v. Sullivan, it is a protection of criticism of public officials. And you can see this is channeling Madison straight from the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so here's the law. It's kind of where we're going to end up. The court concludes in New York Times v. Sullivan that where a defamation plaintiff, where someone's suing to recover, and it's always thought a fortiori, that is, if it's true of a civil plaintiff, it would certainly be true of a government seeking to prosecute. And governments have basically abandoned prosecution of defamation in the wake of New York Times v. Sullivan is virtually impossible to accomplish. So most of the action here is in the civil suit context. The court says that where a plaintiff is a public official, and what's that mean? We'll talk about it in a minute. And the alleged defamation is about a matter of public concern. The plaintiff must prove actual malice to recover. Elected officials are presumed to be public officials, and indeed unelected officials exercising governmental authority are very likely to be deemed public officials for this purpose. In a case that came down after New York Times v. Sullivan, the court, before I do that, I need to define actual malice. So what's meant by actual malice? Well, basically they took the court took the defense of truth and expanded it in two very important ways. First of all, they said the burden can't be placed on the defendant to prove what they said is true. The burden has to be placed on the plaintiff to prove what was said was false. Okay, and this is really important because a lot of this stuff is expression of opinion, or there are doubts about what if it's a matter of fact. The facts are debatable. Okay, and so the defendant wins all the ties. But more than that, it's not enough to prove that the defendant said something that was damaging and false. You must show the defendant either knew it was false or at least was reckless as to falsity. And recklessness here, the court specified in a subsequent case, means at least a conscious awareness of probable falsity. So your speaker or your newspaper editor has to think, yeah, I don't think this is true, but let's run with it anyway. That's required before they can be held liable for defaming a public official. And indeed, this is enforced by a number of this is kind of technical stuff, but procedural protections that are designed to protect newspapers from even having to defend lawsuits in this space. They are granted authority to try to dismiss lawsuits at the outset to avoid even the cost, the burden of defending. In subsequent cases, the court extended this protection to criticism not only of or discussion not only of public officials, but also public figures. And those are people who have become a matter of legitimate, in the court's view, discussion in public discourse. And so certainly people who are like candidates for office, but have not yet been elected are going to be public figures. Frankly, celebrities are probably likely to be deemed public figures. I won't get into much of the detail here, but the court actually identifies two kinds of public figures. General purpose, those are people about whom anything said is protected by the New York Times v. Sullivan actual malice standard. I've always used as the example as quintessential general purpose public figures, past presidential candidates, at least like major party nominees. I think it's probably the case that Mitt Romney is a general purpose public figure for life. Okay? But more common is that people be deemed limited purpose public figures, and that would be that you're a public figure for a particular area of discussion. That is, you did something, you're known as an advocate for response to climate change, and therefore any discussion about you that is related to climate change is subject to the actual malice standard. But if they start attacking, your golf game or, your hygiene, maybe not. Maybe that would be considered unrelated and not subject to the protective standard of New York Times. There's an emphasis here on has the person done something to interject themselves into controversy, but it's not absolutely indispensable that they have done so. People can be dragged into controversy and found to be public figures. Okay, I added, I'm going to go over this very quickly. I added in the Dropbox a case called Tam. TAM. And that case is a case from a lower federal court applying the New York Times v. Sullivan standard. Just, I think it's 2021, maybe 2020. It's very recent. But the judge, who's a very distinguished judge, goes on to say, I think it's time we reconsider New York Times v. Sullivan, because I think it's too protective. I think it's allowed the development of a post-truth culture. That is because it's so hard to hold people accountable for publishing lies that now it's just common to publish lies. And, you know, query is that, you know, when you go down the checkout line in the grocery store, is that evidenced by the National Enquirer headlines? Or, you know, I don't know, some people might say that recent political controversies indicate that people seem pretty free to say anything, whether it can be proved to be false or not, at least in the political area. And so, you know, what can we do differently? One idea here is maybe you could limit the amount of recovery, but still allow people to sue as a vehicle for at least vindicating the truth in cases. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, stay tuned. But as I said to Andrea, you know, when I started teaching in this area almost 20 years ago, New York Times v. Sullivan was thought to be sacrosanct. You know, it was a sacred cow. Nobody even criticized it. But now there's a growing kind of chorus that it might have gone too far, or it might have produced unintended consequences. So let me keep going and talk then about the other part, the other manifestation of the from the founding era, and that is this notion of prior restraint, which in the modern context comes up in the context of judicial injunction of publication. And I've got a short clip here.
There we go.
On June 12, 1971, Richard Nixon's daughter, Tricia, married Edward Cox in the White House Rose Garden. The country watched it all on television. The wedding was still news the next day, but another story on the front page of the New York Times caught the president's attention. The article by Neil Sheehan was the first report of what came to be called the Pentagon Papers, 7,000 pages of highly classified documents and historical narrative, compiled secretly at the orders of former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He had hoped a study of the decision-making process that had led the United States to become so deeply involved in Vietnam would help future policymakers avoid similar errors.
I thought I knew a great deal. I thought I knew most of what was worth knowing about the war. And suddenly, I didn't. It wasn't a reporter's version of an event. It was their version of an event. It was their telegrams, their orders, their memoranda, etc.
The documents proved that American presidents and their closest advisors had steered the United States toward deeper involvement in Vietnam, despite their own grave doubts about the chances for victory. They had known that the Saigon government was weak and incompetent. That the enemy was disciplined and resilient. And that the bombing of the North wasn't working. Yet they had routinely lied about all these things to Congress and the American people.
I certainly don't endorse anyone releasing top secret material to the press. On the other hand, I was very concerned about the fact that the government was not being upfront with the American people in certain respects with the Vietnam War.
2 copies of the report had been stored at the Rand Corporation, a California think tank, where Daniel Ellsberg, one of the study's 36 authors, worked as an analyst. Ellsberg had once supported the war. He'd served in the Pentagon and spent 2 years working for the State Department in Vietnam. But he had come to see the war as profoundly immoral and hoped that if Americans understood how administration after administration had misled them about what was being done in their name, they might help bring it to an end. He and Anthony Russo, another Rand employee, secretly copied most of the report. Ellsberg offered it to 3 leading anti-war senators, hoping they would be willing to reveal its contents. None dared do it. Meanwhile, Neil Sheehan of the New York Times, who had been reporting on Vietnam since 1962 and had already secretly read some of the documents, asked Ellsberg to show him the whole report.
At that point, I was very passionate about the war. I felt that it was really wrong because we were getting a lot of Americans and a lot of Vietnamese killed for no purpose. We were going to lose this war. And so I vowed to myself when I saw this material that this is never going to go back into a government safe again. The American public have paid for it with the lives of their sons and with their treasure, and it's going to be published.
That piece in the Times is, of course, a massive security leak from the Pentagon, you know. Yeah. It all relates, of course, to everything up until we came in. Yeah. And it's hard on Johnson, it's hard on Kennedy, it's hard on Lodge.
At first, Nixon was not unduly disturbed by the newspaper's revelations. They reflected badly on his Democratic predecessors, not on him. But Henry Kissinger quickly convinced Nixon that if the Times were permitted to reveal the classified secrets of earlier presidents, it was only a matter of time until someone leaked his own. The Justice Department obtained a temporary court order forbidding the Times from publishing further installments on the grounds of national security. But soon, both the Boston Globe and the Washington Post were also printing excerpts. On June 30th, 1971, the United States Supreme Court, citing the First Amendment, ruled 6-3 that the Times had the right to publish the stolen documents.
And I went down into the basement to wait for the presses to start to roll, and they had these huge round reams of paper. And finally the presses started to roll. And it was just an exquisite moment of vindication of the freedom of the press in this country and how important it is.
That changed our whole attitude toward government. Up until then, the president wouldn't lie. After then, they always lie.
And there's actually a second clip of that same place that is very good to use as well. But I think, and let me go back to my slides, I think that clip, and again, the URL is here. I think that clip does a really good job of underscoring 2 of the themes we've been looking at, both the importance of the prohibition on injunction of publication or dissemination of information, and that's really kind of the focus of the court in the Pentagon Papers case. And there, just kind of discussed very briefly in the excerpt, but the court in the Pentagon Papers case stresses, look at the very core of the First Amendment. going back to even Blackstone, who had a very crabbed understanding of the First Amendment. The thing you could not do was prevent publication. And that's again in part because of this forgiveness versus permission issue. Publication allows unfounded fears of harm to be exposed as false. Now, one issue is, you could pass a statute that says don't publish any secret material, and so that statute was on the books. And so how is a judicial injunction of the New York Times any different from having that statute? And it's thought that, well, for one, when a judicial injunction has your name on it, there's really no doubt that if you're Neil Sheehan of the New York Times and you continue to publish, you're going to be prosecuted. They've targeted you. Plus, there's this is kind of a technical legal point, but an important one. The judicial injunctions come and are protected with what's called the collateral bar rule, and that is that if you are under a judicial injunction that is unlawful or violates the Constitution, your obligation is to appeal to a higher court and get it dissolved. Which, as you notice, that's what the New York Times did here. They stopped publishing. And asked for, prompt intervention by the U.S. Supreme Court. Notice how quick all this was. You go from Nixon's wedding at the beginning of June to by the end of June, the Supreme Court's rule. This is very hurry up kind of pace. And it's because during this entire time, publication had been stayed. And they honored the injunction because if you violate an injunction, even while it's pending appeal, you're not allowed to contest the lawfulness of the injunction. The only questions that are relevant in the prosecution for violating an injunction is, are you the person enjoined, and did you violate it? There are no excuses. Because if you think the injunction's wrong, you're supposed to challenge it in court, not defy it. And so for all those reasons, it's thought that judicial injunction of publication really is the equivalent of the licensing scheme that the British liberty of the press dispensed with. Now, one question is, does that mean you can never enjoin publication? Well, okay, the Supreme Court issued a very terse per curiam opinion that said there's a heavy presumption against prior injunction of publication, that the government to justify such an injunction must carry a heavy burden of persuasion. That's all kind of vague. And I think it was vague in part because, as you see, all this happened very quickly. And so the justices didn't really have the ordinary time they have to write opinions and share them and argue about the language and stuff. They really felt they needed to act in this case very quickly. Now, so in accompanying that per curiam, that terse, the New York Times may publish, this injunction is dissolved, were a number of opinions for particular justices expressing views. And actually on this question, can you ever enjoin, Justices Black and Douglas at least purported to say, no, absolutely not. No, you just can't do it. Justice Brennan said, well, I would only do it in the most extreme circumstances. And he talks about circumstances where publication would inevitably, directly, and immediately produce an event imperiling American forces. And he talks about, as an example, the equivalent of publishing the sailing date of a transport ship. That's basically handing it over to the enemy submarine. And he also talks about it might be different in a declared war. And nobody's declared war in Vietnam. And so that's important too. And then you have these other views that are even a little more open. And so it's a little vague as to what this case stands for in terms of in other circumstances, but it certainly stands for the proposition, probably something like the Stewart and White position, which is kind of a intermediate position, that you really got to show that horrible consequences will undoubtedly follow publication before injunction will be allowed. Now, it's important to see the Pentagon Papers case did not say that the New York Times or the Washington Post couldn't be criminally punished after the fact for publication. And actually expressly was decided on the point that all we're deciding is it can't be enjoined from publishing. But what's interesting is they were never prosecuted. And again, I think this whole episode illustrates some of the wisdom of the concern about prior restraints, which is once the public read these excerpts, they thought we needed to know this. As Neil Sheehan said, we deserve to know this. And so the administration was not going to prosecute them once the public saw this, because that would have produced an outrage in its own right? And so this was kind of an example of how the proof was in the pudding, and the publication exonerated the publishers, even though they arguably violated statutes. They were never prosecuted for that, because it would have been such an unpopular prosecution. So let me stop there. Like I said, I could also say a little bit about some more social media issues and stuff, but I want to, those are the main subjects I wanted to treat, and I'd rather talk to you guys about those than go into this additional space, unless there's just, there are no questions. So anybody have any questions about what has been treated so far?
Here's what I'll say. I'm excited to kind of hear this next step too.
Okay.
Like actually bring it into this 21st century, the social media aspect here.
Okay, well, let's do that. And again, you guys can always reach out to me with questions after the fact. So let's look at the social media stuff. Okay, and so again, I gave you, I think, a really good overview is this article by my student. And it has the advantage of being very readable and not too long. And so I recommend it to you. Basically, there are two controversies that have arisen. I mean, several cases, but they're kind of two issues that have arisen in the context of social media and to the extent to which social media should be protected as or free speech and free press issues arising in this context. One is, as I suggested earlier, an issue that's arisen in Kentucky and went all the way to the Sixth Circuit, and which is the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit here in Cincinnati, and also then in New York, in the case I referred to, and I've given you these cases. The Knight First Amendment Institute is a case in the Dropbox for you to look at. And in both of these cases, you had, on the one hand, you had Governor Bevin of Kentucky, and in the other, you had President Trump of the United States, had Twitter accounts. And so they would, they would tweet on them. And I don't know a whole lot about this, but I'm told the way this works is that, other people can then comment on the tweets, and people can have threaded comments that comment on comments. And most of the people who were following Bevin and Trump on Twitter were cheering them on. But there were some people who weren't so enthusiastic and were quite critical of some of the things both of these men were saying. And so in both instances, Bevin and Trump, they have the ability to basically turn off certain followers. And that would make it so followers couldn't comment on the tweets anymore, and in fact, couldn't see them directly themselves. They could maybe get somebody else who could see them, to tell them about it, or some of these tweets were being reported on in the press, but they were not able to follow kind of in real time as these tweets were added. That was never passed upon by the U.S. Supreme Court, because before it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, events kind of overtook it, because for one, Trump lost the election, but even more to the point is, and we'll get to the significance of this in a moment, Twitter removed his account. And so that by the time that case got to the U.S. Supreme Court, it was dismissed as moot. The lower courts that address this, interestingly enough, split. And this is what my student's article is about, that the Cincinnati Court of Appeals said there's no First Amendment problem with Governor Bevin shutting people down on his Twitter feed because it's his Twitter feed. It's his space for him to communicate his ideas, and he needs to have complete control over that space. And they analogized it to like if he was, going to give a speech to supporters at, in Cincinnati in a room, in a ballroom rented at the Hyatt Regency. That might be open to people, but if you started, disrupting the event or even, asking lots of unpopular questions, you might be asked to leave. You probably would be asked to leave. Okay. And that's okay, because that's a space for him to communicate his message. It's not a space for everybody to engage in discourse. But the Second Circuit said, no. This is much more like what the First Amendment doctrine calls a public forum. Because Trump, that was the Trump case, had allowed a lot of people to enter this space and comment favorably and disfavorably on him, at least for a period of time. He had created a forum for discourse, and he could not now shut it down to people he disagreed with. He kind of lost control of it, if you will. It became a public-owned space, not his own space. The other interesting thing here about all this stuff is, of course, these are private social media platforms. And so what do we make of the fact that they assert, like, for example, Twitter actually has in their use terms of use, we reserve the right to cancel any account for any reason or no reason. I'm saying that is a quotation. They say for any reason or no reason. Like we just don't like anymore. You're off Twitter. And so so then they removed Trump after January 6th. It wasn't exactly for no reason, I think people would say. But I mean, they're not a governmental entity. And so they never had to explain why they could silence Trump in a way that was consistent with the First Amendment. And so when this case that arose out of the Second Circuit went to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, the entire court dismissed it as moot. Clarence Thomas added an opinion that said, I completely agree with that. That's the right result. This is moot because things have gone on. But hey, notice what happened here. The Sixth Circuit was concerned about refusing a few dissenters access to this, social media platform. But then, in the wake of January 6th, Trump and everybody else is removed at the whim of Twitter, and nobody thinks that's a problem. Well, I think it might be a problem. I think that notwithstanding the fact that Twitter is nominally a private space, it has become a quasi-public entity. And Clarence Thomas says, it's a very interesting opinion, which I included in the Dropbox. Thomas says, we need to adjust our law to take account of the fact that social media platforms, some of them, even though they are in private hands, have become so important to discourse that they are analogous to entities that we have previously recognized as quasi-public and therefore subject to much greater governmental regulation. And he says, he uses the example of in the 19th century, railroads, steamships, paddle wheelers, inns, taverns, theaters were all thought to be quasi-public entities. And therefore, they were not able to exclude anyone for any reason or no reason. They were only able to exclude for reasons that the courts would recognize as legitimate and valid. Okay? And so, for example, if I was using class, if you show up to the inn and you can't pay, the innkeeper can deny you a room. But if you show up to the inn and you're dressed in LA Rams garb and the innkeeper is a Bengals fan, the innkeeper can't turn you away for that reason. The innkeeper, the common law says the innkeeper cannot choose his guests. And so Thomas says we need to develop a doctrine like this for social media that restricts, arbitrary denial of access. Well, that's just a separate opinion. And he says, there's no, I recognize this is not the case to do this, but he's basically throwing it out there as an invitation to scholars and others to think about bringing cases in the future because of, basically the importance of these social media platforms, that they have a chokehold over discussion, and allowing them to just be in the hands of Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whatever is intolerable. It gives those people greater authority than we'd ever entrust to the government. And so those are kind of the, if you will, the 21st century. That I think is the terrain where the next battles are going to be fought. And one of the big issues is, how do we map on, a jurisprudence that was, built around the Gutenberg printing press, to a very different media. I mean, on the one hand, newspapers, for example, they're privately owned, and they are free to deny, if I say, hey, I want you to publish my law review articles, Indianapolis Star, I don't think it's going to work. They're going to say thanks, but no, and they're free to do that. But Thomas is saying that Twitter is not like a newspaper, because it's not one among many. It basically has no competition, at least in this particular space, doing what it does. And so we need to treat it differently. I don't know how I feel about that, but I just think it's really interesting. And I do think it's definitely kind of the frontier in terms of how the law is going to evolve.